I am doing a presentation on artificial cranial modification and its relationship between that and status. So, artificial cranial modification is an ancient practice in which the cranial whelp is modified to achieve a desired shape for various cultural reasons. In this presentation, I'm going to be exploring the relationship between cranial whelp modification and status. Artificial cranial whelp modification is an intentional modification of an infant's malleable skull to achieve a desired head shape. During the first few years of life, the bones of the skull are quite malleable, and with persistent shaping by adult caretakers, the skull will eventually retain a form created through consistent manipulation. So the skull of infant contains connective tissues called fontanelles. The fontanelles allow for flexibility in the skull so the baby can pass through the birth canal and the brain can grow as the baby develops. There are 6 fontanelles, 1 frontal, 1 occipital, 2 sphenoid, 1 mastoid, and 2 mastoid. And as you can see in these pictures, the black areas, right here and here, all represent the fontanelles. And as time goes on, during an infant's life, the fontanelles close. And so this is a newborn, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, and then around the 3-year mark is when the fontanelles completely close. And this graph just shows the percentage of open fontanelles in relationship with the lifespan of or 12 to 24 months for an infant and how they close as time goes on. And so basically the first few years of life allow for the shape of the cranium to be altered, and that's what allows for the mothers to change the shape of the skull. So there are various methods for artificial cranial modification. I will discuss some of the more widely, oh gosh, no. Okay, so I'm going to discuss some of the more widely used ones. The first image is of a Native American mother who is carrying her infant strapped to a board in order to alter the shape of her infant's skull. The board is covered with moss or loose fibers of cedar bark. In order to retain the head shape, they placed a pad on the infant's forehead and a piece of bark on top of that pad. And with compression over time, that allows the shape of the cranium to be altered. And as you can see in the first photo, it's a really unique elongated shape. And that's one of the more drastic examples. The second picture is of an Antilles mother. The Antilles practice the tradition by placing their child soon after birth between 2 boards. One of the boards is on the forehead and the other is on the back of the head. And it's held together by 2 leather straps. And that compression over time also causes an elongation of the skull, which is also kind of like similar to the first image. And then the last picture on there is a bunch of different images of different types of deformation. Letter A is cuneiform deformation, and that's where a head is strapped with tablets that are held together tightly. And letter B and C is a form of deformation where a cotton padded plank is tightly fixed with a ribbon to flatten the forehead. So that's just also another form of compression that's used. D is annular modification, which is a form of band compression. E is a bilobed head, which is achieved by fontanelle compression. And F is a head pressure called a fontanelle. And then I is bonnets and headbands that are used for cranial deformation as well. So Eric Dingwall was one of the first anthropologists to study the relationship between artificial cranial deformation and status. He published a book in 1931 called Artificial Cranial Deformation, in which he studied the relationship between status and other things. He basically wanted to uncover why these many different cultures modified their crania. He studied cultures in Europe, Asia, Africa, Indonesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, New Zealand, Mexico, and South America. So he did a lot of work in the field, and after his extensive research, he thought it was reasonable to conclude that the practice of cranial deformation was passed from one culture to another around the world, and he stated that the reason it was passed from culture to culture was that royal dignitaries were represented as having deformed heads. And so it was basically widely accepted, and it was passed from one to another. And his research was kind of monumental at the time, and he was seen as like a great anthropologist. And his conclusions, when other anthropologists discuss the relationship between status and deformation, his research was widely accepted, not only just for status though, for other things too relating to cranial deformation. And so he did a lot of great research in the field. And later on, Dr. Plonowski published a book on archaeological evidence left behind in several Tahanaku burial sites. He studied items and skeletal material left behind in the burial sites and thought that there may be a link between cranial deformation and status. Among the skeletal remains, he found evidence of several types of cranial deformation, and he discusses the presence of cranial deformation in relation to status. After his extensive study, he stated that there was no conclusive evidence that status and cranial deformation were linked. He said that after studying the crania of priests, he found that they were hardly ever deformed, and among his studies and other types of deformation, he found that cranial deformation influenced people's individual character, their creative facilities, mind, sense of sight, and sexual functions. And so he was kind of one of the second people to publish. He published several volumes of his book, and most of his book he's looking at archaeological material, as in like clay pots and things that were left behind. There wasn't very many crania that were left behind, but he does discuss all of the different crania that were found by this culture. And his work was done in 1957, which was shortly after Eric Dingwall's, and his work is also discussed by a lot of researchers, and a lot of his beliefs were, some anthropologists believed in what he said and others didn't. And then later on, the same cultures, the Tahanaku, were studied by Christina Torres-Ruff, Michelle Bonowski, and Deborah Bloom. And Torres-Ruff's book examined how the practice of cranial shaping was passed from one culture to another. She examined different crania to observe how the Tahanaku culture impacted other cultures, and statistically examined the presence of modification and the type of modification, the sex of the decedent, the burial objects, and the relative date of the crania. She found that the reason for the cultures that they modified their crania was for identity and possibly as a signifier that the decedents were associated with the prestigious group. Her research showed that burial goods located with the decedent showed no conclusive correlation between status and cranial modification. So her idea on if they were related or not kind of contradicts what Eric Dingwall found and what Dr. Plonowski found, but she was kind of the first ones to say, well, maybe this research that has been done isn't really concluding one way or another. And so then shortly after that, well, this was in 2014. Vera Teasler published a book called The Bioarchaeology of Artificial Cranial Modification. And she's done several in-depth studies on artificial cranial modification. She's currently one of the leading bioanthropologists in the field right now studying that. And she's analyzed the topic in several journals, and she mostly focused her study on Mesoamerican cultures. She uses the information from various credible sources to provide a detailed look at Mesoamerican cranial deformation, and she found that cranial deformation was done in Mesoamerican cultures and was practiced in order to define beauty, ideological emulation, and social distinction. She discusses how some of the historic sources, such as Eric Dingwall, and she says they have a simplistic interpretation on the motives behind cranial deformation. She states we cannot ascertain underlying realities of why it happened based off of this research and other research, because the research that they did didn't really provide enough evidence to say one way or another if the two things were related. Through her studies, she wanted to find the meaning of cranial deformation, so that was like her main goal. So throughout her scholarly research, she studied artificial cranial deformation, and that was her main motive, to figure out like why the cultures did it. And she found that there was 3 main cultural dimensions of cranial modification, and the first one was organoplastic motifs, and that is the treatment of the head as an object to ward off sickness or spiritual energy, to gain spiritual energy, and the spiritual energy is located in the head, and by altering the shape of the head, that helps ward off sicknesses and helps you retain your spiritual energy. It also protects the physical integrity of the child and helps them integrate into life. And then the second one was the performance of the cranial shaping. The daily performance of cranial shaping is dominated by the life of infants to help integrate them into society and symbolizes the baby becoming human. So that's basically another way to like integrate them into society, and it's kind of like a tradition. They have ceremonies around this to like kind of say that the baby's going from a child to an adult. And then lastly, the head shapes becoming visible emblems of identity. So it would be like achieving the aesthetic ideal and emulating godly figures. So that was the last reason she saw for that out of all of her studies, and that would be all of the cultures she studied, mostly in Mesoamerica and some other cultures around the world. So today, artificial cranial modification is used to treat craniocytosis, and craniocytosis is the premature fusion of one or more of the cranial sutures, which causes a distortion of the cranial shape. And that's seen in these images. And the only way to treat this type of deformation, which happens at birth, is through surgery. And another type of common deformation we see today in Western society is just asymmetry. And so helmet therapy is a common method that's used to treat the asymmetry. And what is done is basically a custom manufactured hard plastic helmet is used, and it applies pressure to the areas that need to be changed in order to round the infant's skull. And this therapy is quite expensive. It can range, the cost of one helmet is $1,773, and the total cost of helmet therapy is $4,200, which is really expensive. And a lot of times it's not considered serious enough for insurance to cover it, so families have to pay for it if they want to treat this in their children. And so this kind of suggests too that even today status is correlated with changing the shape of one's infant's skull. And out of the 72 sources that I reviewed for my research, I'm convinced that more research needs to be done on the relationship between cranial deformation and status. Although the majority of the research is inconclusive, and there's no definitive conclusion and no relationship is drawn. In order to better understand the relationship between status and cranial deformation, a study should be conducted on the archaeological materials. So there's grave inventories, and they should be looked at, and all the material that has been buried with one person should be studied, because through the items that one is buried with, they can determine whether or not there was status associated with that person. So depending on the culture, if someone is buried with something that was seen as a high status item, they will be able to determine whether or not that person there was a relationship between deformation and status. Archaeological grave inventories of cultures that practice deformation should be done. A statistical analysis should be done on the presence and absence of burial goods associated with status. Out of the various cultures I studied, the Tiwanaku culture would be the most ideal culture to study. During my research, I found conflicting sources that said that cranial deformation was linked to status, and I also found ones that said cranial deformation was not linked to status. For the Tiwanaku culture, 5 of my sources, I found that there was no relationship between cranial deformation and status, and 3 said that there was a relationship. So for this culture specifically, there's no way to really tell, like as of now in the research that's been done, if there is a relationship between the two. And so it would be really good if there was a study that was done to look at the inventory of graves and stuff, because that information is out there. And knowing this, I hope to further my research by taking a deeper look at this culture and the burial goods to discover if there's a relationship. So that's what I plan to do in the future, and I just wanted to say thank you so much to Dr. Stubblefield for all of her help and spending a lot of time with me in the lab. She taught me how to do cranial measurements, and I haven't taken human osteology yet, and so I'm planning on taking that next semester. And so that's kind of been an issue, and I'm really excited that I'm going to be taking it and all the help I've received, because she spent a lot of time helping me in the lab, and it really means a lot to me that she would take her time out to help me. And I'm really sad she's going to be leaving, but I'm still excited about my education and furthering that. And I also want to say thank you to Patrice and McNair for all the help that I've received. I know I'm really nervous for this presentation, and yeah, so thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?
Are the burial inventories, are they pretty dispersed around, or is it all accessible online pretty much?
They're pretty dispersed around. Through my research, I found mostly that a lot of the information is really hard to get, but I have to go to the library and ILL things because it's usually not accessible online. Most of my sources that I found I get them from the library, and they ship them from like all over the United States from libraries, and they're these old broken books, and I have to figure out where the information is. And those are usually where the grave inventories are. I've only been able to find a couple in the library here, but to the cultures that practice cranial modification, those grave inventories are usually going to have to be ILL'd, and that type of information can't be found online. So that's going to be another tricky part. Yeah?
Christine, did the cranial modification occur equally in gender, or,
That's another really good question, because it didn't occur equally in gender. Sometimes it was practiced only in women in some cultures, and sometimes it was only practiced among men, and so it just depends on the culture, because every culture is different, but definitely there's a difference depending on the culture. Yeah?
So I guess as you go farther back looking, it seems it would be more speculative on, say, status, because whether or not something's buried with them, or whether how much or how common it is among however much data or grave sites you've collected. Why not simply analyze this, cranial modification status today by, say, income? That seems more. It seems more powerful to do it today than it would to, say, predict it and speculate on the past.
Yeah, well, the thing about that is I find more interest in studying archaeological evidence and in understanding past cultures, and that's another thing too. Like, it could be done today, But for my particular interests, I want to take a look at these and I want to understand why it was done and figure out these reasons. Because to me, it's almost like, why did this happen? I really want to know why this happened and if there's a relationship. So yeah, it's a good question though. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just kind of a comment, through the years with medical advancements, I will just comment on when I had children, we were told to lie them on their bellies. Thus, they didn't get the flat head. I mean, and that wasn't why you did that. You just laid them on their stomachs. And then it came along, like when my kids were having kids, it was, no, you need to place them on their backs. And then in order to not get the flat head, you had to make sure they had enough time being on their stomachs. So otherwise it would be a possibility for the helmet. And I just think that's interesting with the way information changes, that how it impacts a lot of things physically.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting too because a lot of times I know one girl who she got a helmet for her son, and her son, it was just a very small asymmetry, but she still she wanted her son to look perfect, you know, and I understand that, but it's different because before, I mean, money can pretty much buy you anything nowadays. This kind of goes along with like plastic surgery and stuff too, but yeah, it's interesting.